Hello. This is the very first of your flipped lessons. A flipped lesson basically is where the learning that you usually do in your classroom, you do at home, and the work that you usually do at home, you do in class. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the PowerPoint that we would have looked at in the classroom. You're going to do some activities which you would have done in the classroom. And then you're going to bring that into the lesson. And then what we'll be able to do is have a look at the work that you've done. And really focusing on how can we improve it, how can we work on that work so that we make it better than it already is. And so you can see from the title of this, the first thing that we're looking at is what are drugs. This is a new topic. Essentially what you're going to need to know is all sorts of stuff about what drugs are, what the problems are with using them, some issues to do with the classification of drugs, so say for example should marijuana be a Class C or a Class B drug, the ideas of declassifying drugs entirely. So there's all sorts of interesting issues that we're going to have a look at across the course of this topic, but this one in particular is just simply what drugs are, and then a little bit about what Christians think about drugs. So then, what is the most widely used drug in the world? Well, you might be thinking that it's marijuana, for example. You'd be wrong. You might think that it's alcohol, which would be a good guess, but not true. Tobacco, you might be thinking. Unfortunately not. The most widely used drug in all of the world is caffeine. If you think about the number of people every single day who use this drug, it's what we call a social drug. It's not illegal, but it is addictive. I know certainly that if I don't have my morning cup of coffee, then I come in with a pounding headache. I need my caffeine hit every single day. They've grabbed me. But if you think about the way the caffeine's used these days, it's actually what we're finding more and more is that it's people drinking it not as part of caffeine, but as part of very sugary drinks. So Coca-Cola, for example, but also most of those energy drinks that people bring into school are stacked full of caffeine, absolutely packed to the rafters with it. And it's interesting really that the exam board do consider caffeine as a drug. So it begs the question, well, what are drugs? If caffeine's the most widely used one, well, what are we classifying as drugs? It's quite clearly not just the illegal ones that we're used to, it's something more than that. So we need to have a think about what that might be. So you can see here that the exam board definition of a drug is a substance which, when taken, affects the body or mind, which is a pretty broad definition when you think about it, because the vast majority of things that we put into our bodies have some sort of effect on our body and our mind. If I eat a chocolate cake, for example, it makes me incredibly happy, because I love chocolate cake, who doesn't? And it also has an effect on my body. You know, the calories are broken down and I use that to generate fats, you know, but also I get that sugar rush from it as well. So there's all sorts of effects that a chocolate cake has on my body and mind, but we wouldn't really want to consider it to be a drug. So it's a little bit tricky, this example definition. I don't think it's a particularly strong definition of drugs, and you might want to think yourself what a definition of drugs might be. Obviously, when we talk about drugs, we need perhaps a little bit more guidance then in this topic about what we mean, because the example definition isn't perhaps strong enough. So on the next slide, we're going to have a look at the different categories of drugs that are provided for us by the exam board, and talk a little bit more about exactly what those things are. Alright, so these are the different categories of drugs. You can see we've had social drugs, prescribed drugs, over-the-counter drugs, solvents, and then illegal drugs. So let's start with social drugs. When we talk about social drugs, we're particularly talking about a legal drug which is still addictive. So say for example, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, these are all legal, but yet addictive. And generally speaking, what you'll find is with a lot of those, they have age restrictions on them. So obviously, tobacco and alcohol, you wouldn't be able to sell to an under 18 in this country. Caffeine, interestingly though, we do allow. And there's an interesting question there about which things we do classify and at what age group we tell people you can't have them or you can have them. And that's very different across the world. It's one of the things we're going to have a look at and think about whether it needs to be changed. A prescribed drug is something that you can only get access to with a doctor's consent. So when you go to your GP, you've got a problem, you've got hair sprouting out of your nose or something, you ask the GP for the nose hair removal cream that can only be prescribed to you. It's too powerful a drug for it to be given to you just in a local supermarket, so the doctor needs to say that you can have that. Similarly to those are over-the-counter drugs, and there's kind of two categories to this. There's the over-the-counter drugs you can get from local supermarket, like a box of paracetamol, which pretty much anybody can go in and buy. In limited quantities, they're usually regulated. You're not allowed to just go in and buy, a whole drugstore worth. And the other type of over-the-counter drug are the ones that you'd only get from a pharmacist. So perhaps they're slightly stronger versions of things like cough syrups and things like that. So the pharmacist has to be sure that you're in need of those things before you can buy them. So you get these slightly softer drugs which can be bought just by going to the counter and buying them. Others you have to get through the pharmacist. The next category is the solvents. Solvents are basically a type of drug that can be inhaled, and particularly in the 1980s and 1990s they were being abused quite heavily. Things like glue, certain kinds of glue, certain kinds of felt tip pen, for example, could be have solvents in them. Gas lighter fluid, that's a solvent. So it's anything basically which you can inhale and which gives kind of a druggy effect. Again, these are usually age restricted these days. You can't often go into a shop and just simply buy solvents. Usually you have to be over 16. There's some exceptions to that, but generally speaking that's the case. The final category is the illegal drugs. That's something that is what we would traditionally think of as being an illegal drug. Cocaine, marijuana, heroin, all sorts of things. And these are separated into different categories, different classifications of drugs, A, B and C. And we'll talk about those classifications in a later lesson and really talk about are those classifications meaningful and do they have an impact, either positively or negatively, on whether or not people will take those drugs. You'll see that at the bottom of this slide it tells you that you need to complete activity 1. You'll find that on the worksheet on Edmodo. Very simple activity. You just need to find some examples of each of these kinds of drugs, just so we're really clear when we come back into the lesson and we talk about these that we've got the right kind of idea about what these drugs are. We'll also be able to see that a lot of these drugs will cross over into perhaps more than one of these categories, and we'll talk about exactly where that would happen in our lesson after you've completed this work. Now this is where I think this starts to get a little bit interesting, this topic. There's a huge range of issues surrounding drugs. There's been debate for, well, basically ever about which drugs should be available to what people at what time, and it's always been something that's been vigorously debated. Particularly the classification of cannabis in this country has been something that recently has been debated quite substantially, but also tobacco. Obviously it wasn't that long ago that you could be 16 and buy tobacco, and that's gone up to 18. We're talking all the time about the way that we classify our drugs, the way that we sell our drugs, whether that's social drugs or whether that's prescription, over-the-counter drugs. It's always talking about how we regulate this. We've got to make sure that people are safe. That's what people want. They want to make sure that the 10 or 11-year-old kid can't get access to things that are going to harm them. But at the same time, people have a right to freedom of choice, that self-determination we talked about last half term. And so you've got to kind of balance these two things out. But it's interesting, and in the second activity I'm going to pose you a question that I want you to think really seriously about. Essentially, if we want to protect people from harmful things, harmful drugs that do damage to their bodies and to their minds, then why don't we ban things like sugars, or certainly products with high levels of sugar in them? These things do incredible damage to our society. We've got the most obese society in the whole of the European Union, in the UK. So why don't we limit the amount of sugar that we can sell to young people, for example? At the moment we don't, and some people might say, well, let's regulate that. Here's a drug that's quite clearly harmful to the health of our young people, why aren't we doing more about it? So I'd like you to think about that question, to write your answer to the 3-mark question, and then we're going to come back into the lesson and we're going to debate that. And I will be expecting everybody to be able to take part in this. That's one of the benefits of these flipped lessons, is that you've got a chance to think about it before you come into the lesson. So I don't want to be asking this question about regulation of sugar and then have a load of blank faces staring at me. This is an opportunity to really think about it and come in prepared to have something to say about this particular topic. And also don't forget, this is a GCSE style question, so really think carefully about, are you going to get 3 marks? Have you thought about 3 reasons for the views that you're given? Other than that, good luck, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you think. Okay, we're up to the final part of this first flip lesson. Very, very briefly today, I'd like us to think about the Christian attitudes towards drug abuse. by and large, this is really simple, and this goes for the whole topic. The Christian attitude towards drug abuse can be summed up in this one quote from St. Paul, who was an early Christian, who said, "Don't you know that you yourself are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him." And that's from 1 Corinthians 13, which was a letter that St. Paul sent to the people in Corinth. It's a really important quote. You can use it time and time again throughout all of your RE exam. Essentially, we usually call this the your body is a temple argument. And Christians generally believe that you shouldn't do anything that, to yourself that will damage your body, or will damage your mental health in any way either. And obviously, if you think about the use of hard drugs, things like heroin and cocaine, it's quite clear that those things damage your body. I don't think anybody would argue against that. Some people might want to argue that other drugs don't. Some people might say, well, marijuana, for example, there's not a huge amount of evidence to show that that has any kind of physical effect upon a person apart from the short-term effects. But when you look a little bit deeper, there are statistics to show that long-term marijuana use can lead to all sorts of things like psychosis, all sorts of mental illnesses. And obviously when we talk about social drugs like alcohol and tobacco, a lot of Christians would say, well, look, don't do it, you know, you're damaging God's temple. Whereas, on the other hand, a lot of Christians do it. And let's be fair, part of one of the key sacraments of Christianity is drinking wine as part of communion, which seems to be a bit of a mixed message. So this is one quote that we're going to focus in on for the time being. There are other quotes that we can use, especially when we're talking about alcohol. But for the time being, I just want us to think about this one. Now, in a second, I'm going to ask you to do a 4-mark question about the Christian attitude towards drug abuse. It's fairly straightforward, this, for Christianity. As I said on the last slide, Christians believe that if you damage God's gift, the human body, then God will destroy you. You know, that's a pretty clear statement that you damage yourself, you're damaging God's temple, and God's not going to be best pleased with you. However, there are some Christian groups who do actually use drugs. In particular, the Ethiopian Coptic Church, they believe that you should use marijuana. Not that it's, you know, okay to use it, that it actually should be an active part of their worship. Now this is a pretty kind of far out group. It's a very small group of Christians, focused mainly in America, which is slightly confusing being that they're the Ethiopian Coptic Church. What I have done is on Edmodo I've put a link to a film that was made in the 1970s. It's only 10 minutes long. It just tells you a little bit about the Ethiopian Coptic Church. You don't have to watch this, but it's just a little bit of interesting background information. If anything, it's just worth watching because it's just like watching an episode, watching the film Anchorman, but it's actually real. So have a look at it, see what you think. You'll also see that activity 3 at the bottom of this page is to answer the 4-mark question that I mentioned. I'd like you to really think about explaining that quote, "Your body is a temple." Remember, it's no good just saying the Christians believe in your body is a temple. You've got to be able to say what it means to believe in your body is a temple, and also then link it back to the question you were asked. Right, so really think about that. And you might want to bring in the idea that there are some Christians who disagree with this. There are some Christians, like the Ethiopian Coptic Church, who actually think that it's okay to use drugs. That's a brilliant thing to be able to bring into the exam because it shows an extended knowledge and understanding of Christianity, beyond it just being one idea about how to follow the beliefs. That basically wraps it up for this particular flip lesson. I'd be really interested to hear your feedback on how you think it's been. You might just think, well, you know, you bore me to death in class by talking to me. The last thing I want is you to then bore me to death at home. But I hope what you'll see is that when we go into the classroom, when you've done this flip lesson, that we spend less time with me talking at you and much more time focused on you and your abilities and how to improve and basically how to get a better exam grade, which is what this is really all about. So that's me for the time being. And I'll see you in the next lesson. Ta very much.